If you're about to break down an innocent woman's door, you'd better be absolutely certain who she is. The words would echo through Chief Daniel Carter's mind long before the sun came up, but at 5:17 a.m., certainty was the only thing anyone believed they had. 3 armored SUVs rolled silently into the quiet apartment complex on the east side of Richmond, Virginia, their headlights cutting through the fading darkness while porch lights flickered awake one by one. Neighbors peeked through curtains without daring to step outside. 30 police officers spread across the narrow parking lot with practiced precision, radios whispering, boots moving in perfect rhythm, every face carrying the same tense focus reserved for dangerous operations. Intelligence reports claimed a violent fugitive had disappeared into apartment 214 less than 2 hours earlier. Surveillance teams insisted they had tracked him there. A confidential informant had repeated the address 3 separate times. Every piece of information pointed to the same destination. No one questioned it. On the second floor, behind a faded blue door with chipped white trim, Angela Brooks stood barefoot in her small kitchen, waiting for the coffee maker to finish brewing. At 46, her mornings rarely changed. She liked the quiet before sunrise, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the old wall clock above the sink, and the warm smell of fresh coffee filling the apartment. Her modest home reflected the same discipline she carried through life. Every book sat perfectly aligned on its shelf. Every picture frame was carefully dusted. A folded American flag rested inside a glass display case near the living room window, catching the first pale streaks of dawn. Outside, engines stopped. Doors opened. Boots met pavement. Angela glanced toward the window, sensing movement before hearing it. Years of experience had taught her that silence often arrived just before chaos. She slowly set her coffee mug on the counter. There was no fear in her face, only curiosity. She walked toward the living room, stopping beneath a hallway light whose warm glow illuminated several framed photographs decorating the wall. Family portraits, community awards, a few faded military photographs. One frame hung slightly higher than the others. She noticed it immediately. Habit made her reach up and straighten it by less than an inch. Down below, Chief Carter lifted a hand. Every officer froze. A dispatcher confirmed the address one final time through his earpiece. Apartment 214. Target believed to be inside. Proceed. Carter nodded once. Around him, officers tightened protective vests, exchanged brief looks, and positioned themselves along the stairwell. None of them knew anything about the woman living behind that door. None of them had ever heard the name Angela Brooks. To them, she was simply another unknown resident standing between law enforcement and a suspected criminal. As the team climbed the stairs, the hallway lights buzzed softly overhead, casting long shadows across the faded carpet. Angela looked toward her front door just as 3 firm knocks shattered the morning silence. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She simply drew one slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked forward with calm, measured steps, unaware that within the next few moments, a single object hanging quietly on her wall would change everything. Angela stopped less than 3 feet from the front door and listened. The knocking came again, firmer this time, followed by a calm voice announcing, "Police Department. Please open the door." She glanced at the digital clock on the microwave. 5:18 in the morning. No one visited at that hour unless something had gone terribly wrong. She reached for the deadbolt without rushing, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged. Through the peephole, she could see only fragments of dark uniforms and flashing blue reflections bouncing across the hallway walls. Before her hand touched the lock, another voice outside spoke into a radio. No movement. Stand by. Angela stepped back instead of opening the door immediately. It was not fear that slowed her. It was instinct. Throughout her life, she had learned that calm decisions often mattered more than fast ones. She slipped on a light gray sweater hanging over the dining chair, then quietly picked up her reading glasses from the kitchen counter. As she walked back toward the entrance, her eyes briefly rested on the photographs lining the hallway. One picture showed neighborhood children gathered around a community garden she had helped build. Another captured a Veterans Day ceremony where she stood quietly in the back row while others accepted recognition. She never enjoyed attention. Service had always meant doing the right thing without expecting applause. Outside the apartment, Chief Daniel Carter reviewed the operation one final time. Every report matched. The anonymous caller claimed the suspect had entered apartment 214 shortly after 4 o'clock. Traffic cameras had captured a vehicle matching the description entering the complex. A surveillance officer believed he had seen movement through the living room blinds nearly an hour earlier. Nothing suggested the information was inaccurate. Even so, something unsettled Carter. He had participated in hundreds of operations during his 28 years in law enforcement. Experience had taught him that the smallest inconsistency could change everything. He looked down the narrow hallway. No sounds came from inside the apartment. No hurried footsteps. No raised voices. Only silence. One of the younger officers leaned closer. "Chief, are we waiting?" Carter hesitated for only a second before answering. "Give her another chance to answer." The officer nodded and knocked once more, this time speaking louder. "Ma'am, we need you to come to the door." Inside, Angela rested her hand lightly on the doorknob. "I am coming," she answered in a clear, composed voice. Several officers exchanged surprised glances. Her voice carried no panic, no anger, and no confusion. It sounded almost reassuring. Carter noticed it immediately. Calm voices at 5 in the morning were unusual. He motioned for everyone to hold position. Angela unlocked the first lock, then the second. Before turning the handle, she looked once more toward the hallway wall where dozens of memories quietly watched over the room. The highest frame reflected the soft morning light spilling through the window, its glass catching a brief golden shimmer that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. She exhaled slowly, opened the door a few inches, and met the eyes of the officers standing before her. "Good morning," she said gently. "There must be some kind of mistake." Chief Daniel Carter studied the woman standing quietly behind the partially opened door. She looked nothing like the image that had formed in his mind during the drive across the city. There was no sign of panic, no hurried movements, no attempt to hide anything. Her apartment smelled faintly of fresh coffee and cinnamon, the kind of comforting scent that belonged to an ordinary home waking up for another peaceful morning. Sunlight had only begun to filter through the east-facing window, painting soft bands of gold across polished hardwood floors that reflected years of careful attention. Angela Brooks met his gaze without hostility. "How may I help you, officer?" she asked with the same calm tone she might have used greeting a neighbor. Carter held up a folded sheet containing the warrant information. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe a dangerous individual may have entered this apartment earlier this morning." Angela blinked once, then slowly looked past him at the long line of officers filling the hallway. "You believe someone came into my home while I was asleep?" she asked quietly. "That is part of our investigation," Carter answered. She nodded thoughtfully instead of arguing. "I understand your responsibility. You may come inside. I only ask that you remember this is still someone's home." The simple sentence lingered in the silence. Several officers shifted uncomfortably before stepping through the doorway. They expected clutter, hidden corners, signs of desperation. Instead, they entered a home filled with quiet order. Bookshelves lined one wall, holding biographies, history volumes, and neatly labeled binders. Houseplants stood healthy beside the windows. A folded quilt rested across the sofa with perfect symmetry. Everything suggested patience rather than fear. Carter slowly removed his cap as he walked farther into the living room, scanning each detail with trained eyes. Nothing appeared unusual. One officer checked the bedroom. Another looked inside the small laundry room. A third opened the coat closet and found only jackets arranged by season. Radio updates began arriving every few moments. Bedroom clear. Bathroom clear. Kitchen clear. The expected tension gradually dissolved into uncertainty. Angela remained standing near the entrance with her hands loosely folded, giving the officers space to complete their work without interruption. She neither protested nor followed them. Instead, she watched with quiet dignity that somehow made the apartment feel even smaller. A young officer paused beside a bookshelf after noticing dozens of framed certificates recognizing volunteer work throughout Richmond. Food drives, youth mentoring, veterans assistance, community literacy programs. None of it matched the dangerous profile described in the briefing. Carter noticed the officer's expression but continued surveying the room himself. His attention drifted toward the hallway where family photographs stretched along the wall beneath warm ceiling lights. One frame had been polished so recently that the glass reflected almost perfectly. Above it hung another frame, turned slightly away from the entrance, as though positioned to avoid immediate attention. Carter found himself walking toward it almost without thinking. Behind him, another officer lowered his radio. "Chief," he said carefully, "we have completed every room." Carter did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the wall ahead. There was something about that final frame that seemed strangely familiar, though he could not explain why. Angela quietly noticed where he was looking, but said nothing. The apartment became completely silent except for the faint ticking of the old clock above the kitchen doorway, as Chief Carter took one slow step closer to the object that was about to change everything he believed about the woman standing behind him. Chief Daniel Carter stopped only inches from the final frame. The polished glass reflected his own face before revealing what lay beneath it. It was not a family photograph. It was an identification card displayed inside a custom wooden shadow box beside a neatly folded service patch, and a bronze challenge coin that had clearly been handled with care over many years. The card itself looked old, its edges slightly worn from countless days carried in a uniform pocket before being preserved behind glass. Carter narrowed his eyes. The seal at the top caught the morning light first. Then came the agency name. His breathing slowed. He leaned closer, reading every line one word at a time, as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes already understood. Around him, the apartment remained perfectly still. The younger officers continued waiting near the living room, unaware that their chief had completely stopped moving. One officer quietly cleared his throat. "Chief." No answer came. Carter's attention never left the display. Beneath the identification card rested several commendation ribbons and a citation recognizing extraordinary service during a multi-agency hostage rescue nearly 20 years earlier. The operation's title instantly awakened a memory he had not revisited in years. He remembered the freezing November rain. He remembered the confusion, the fear, and the impossible decisions made in seconds. Most of all, he remembered the woman whose name had spread through briefing rooms afterward with quiet admiration. She had refused interviews. She had declined public recognition. She had disappeared from the headlines almost as quickly as she had entered them. Carter had never met her personally. At least, that was what he had believed until this very moment. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he turned his head toward Angela Brooks. She remained exactly where she had been since opening the door, her hands folded gently in front of her, her face composed, offering neither satisfaction nor resentment. She simply watched him with the calm patience of someone who had long ago accepted that the truth often arrived later than judgment. Carter looked back at the display. The photograph attached to the identification card showed a much younger Angela wearing a dark tactical uniform, her posture straight, her eyes carrying the same quiet confidence he had noticed only minutes earlier. Time had softened a few features, but there was no mistake. It was her. A faint memory surfaced from the edge of his thoughts. Someone carrying an injured officer through heavy smoke. Someone refusing credit after the operation ended. Someone insisting that every member of the team deserved equal recognition. Carter had heard the story dozens of times during leadership training, yet the woman's face had never stayed in his memory until now. His pulse quickened. Behind him, another officer stepped forward. "Chief, should we continue documenting the residents?" Carter slowly raised one hand without looking away from the wall, signaling everyone to remain exactly where they were. The room fell silent again. Even the radio seemed quieter. Angela finally spoke, her voice gentle enough to match the early morning sunlight now filling the apartment. "That identification has been retired for many years," she said. "But I kept it there because it reminds me that service is supposed to protect people, not make them afraid." Carter swallowed hard. For the first time since entering apartment 214, every report, every briefing, and every assumption that had brought his team to this door suddenly felt far less certain than the quiet truth hanging on the wall before him. The silence inside the apartment grew heavier with every passing second. None of the officers understood why their chief had suddenly become so still. They had entered expecting urgency, commands, and quick decisions. Instead, Daniel Carter stood before a simple wall display as though the weight of 2 decades had settled onto his shoulders all at once. He carefully reached toward the wooden frame, but stopped just short of touching the glass. Respect held his hand back. His eyes drifted lower, reading the engraved plaque beneath the identification card. The citation described exceptional courage during a federal rescue operation that had protected both civilians and local law enforcement officers under impossible conditions. Carter remembered sitting in a crowded academy classroom years earlier while instructors spoke about that mission. They had never focused on tactics. They focused on character. They told young officers that the true measure of service was not recognition but sacrifice made without expecting to be remembered. At the time, he had admired the lesson. Now he was standing inside the home of the very person who had become that lesson. One of the detectives stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Chief, is everything all right?" Carter turned slowly, his expression transformed. The confidence that had guided the operation only minutes before had been replaced by quiet disbelief. "Who verified the intelligence?" he asked. The detective glanced at his notebook. It came through the regional task force before dawn. Multiple confirmations. Carter nodded once, but something no longer fit. He looked around the apartment again, this time not as an investigator searching for evidence, but as a man finally seeing what had been there all along. Every photograph reflected years of service to others. Every certificate represented time spent strengthening the community instead of seeking personal reward. A bookshelf held binders labeled with veterans assistance programs, scholarship applications, and neighborhood outreach projects. Nothing in the room suggested secrecy. Everything reflected purpose. Angela walked toward the kitchen without hurry. "The coffee finished brewing a few minutes ago," she said gently. "Would anyone like a cup? It is going to be a long morning for all of us." Several officers exchanged uncertain looks, surprised by the kindness in her voice after such an unsettling beginning. No one answered immediately. Carter looked at her with growing respect. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you are offering hospitality after we arrived under very difficult circumstances." Angela offered a faint smile that reached her eyes. "Bitterness has never solved a misunderstanding, Chief. The truth usually does that on its own." Those words settled over the room like the first warm sunlight reaching the hardwood floor. Carter lowered his gaze for a moment. He realized he had spent years teaching younger officers that every home deserved dignity. Yet this morning he had allowed confidence in a report to become stronger than curiosity about the person behind the address. Before anyone could speak again, his radio crackled sharply. "Dispatch." Interrupted the silence with an urgent update. "Command, be advised. New information has just been received. The original suspect may have been traced to apartment 241 on the opposite side of the building. Repeat, apartment 241. Verification in progress." Every officer in the room froze. Daniel Carter closed his eyes for one brief moment. The apartment number echoed in his mind with painful clarity. They had been standing in apartment 214 all along. No one moved. The words from dispatch seemed to hang in the apartment long after the radio had fallen silent. Apartment 241, not 214. The difference was only two numbers, yet it separated an innocent morning from a mistake that could not simply be erased. Chief Daniel Carter slowly lowered the radio from his shoulder. For the first time in his career, he found himself unable to give an immediate order. Every officer looked toward him, waiting for direction, but his attention remained fixed on Angela Brooks. She did not appear angry. She did not demand explanations. Instead, she quietly walked back into the kitchen and switched off the coffee maker before it began to burn the last few drops inside the glass pot. The simple click echoed through the apartment louder than anyone expected. Carter watched her place 3 ceramic mugs on the counter with the same careful movements she had probably repeated hundreds of mornings before today. That ordinary routine somehow made the mistake feel even heavier. "The coffee is still warm," Angela said softly without turning around. "You all look like you have had a much longer morning than I have." One of the younger officers lowered his eyes, suddenly unable to meet hers. Another quietly removed his gloves and slipped them into his pocket. The apartment no longer felt like the scene of an investigation. It felt like someone else's peaceful home that had been interrupted before sunrise. Carter finally stepped forward. "Ms. Brooks," he began, his voice noticeably quieter than before. "There is no excuse for arriving here based on information that should have been verified more carefully." Angela rested both hands lightly on the kitchen counter before looking back at him. "Morning." Light now poured through the window above the sink, illuminating tiny dust particles drifting through the air like floating pieces of gold. "Chief," she replied gently, Mistakes happen. What matters is what people choose to do after they discover them. Her words settled over every person in the room. Carter thought about the academy lectures, the policies, the years spent teaching accountability to younger officers. None of those lessons felt as powerful as hearing those few simple sentences from the woman whose home had just become the center of their error. He glanced once more toward the wall where her retired identification card remained hanging exactly where she had left it. Beside it stood a photograph of several smiling children planting trees during a community service project. Angela noticed his gaze. "Those children are adults now," she said with a small smile. "Some became teachers. One became a firefighter. Another joined the police department." Carter looked back at her, surprised. "You still keep in touch with them?" "Whenever they need someone to remind them that kindness lasts longer than fear," she answered. A quiet stillness filled the apartment once again, but this time it no longer carried tension. It carried reflection. Outside, the first rays of sunrise stretched across the apartment courtyard, turning the windows of neighboring buildings into sheets of amber light. Somewhere below, birds began singing as if the city itself had decided to start over. Daniel Carter drew one slow breath. He knew the next decision he made would define far more than the outcome of a mistaken operation. It would define the kind of leader he truly was. Daniel Carter reached slowly for the radio on his shoulder, but instead of issuing another command, he switched it off. The faint static disappeared, leaving only the quiet sounds of the apartment and the distant song of birds greeting the new morning. Every officer noticed the gesture. Their chief had deliberately chosen to stop listening to outside noise so he could deal with the truth standing directly in front of him. He removed his cap, holding it respectfully at his side before facing Angela Brooks. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice steady but deeply sincere. "On behalf of every officer who entered your home today, I owe you an apology. We came here convinced we already knew the story before we ever met the person living inside it. That was our failure." The room remained silent. No one interrupted. Angela looked at the officers gathered across her living room. Some were veterans with decades of service. Others looked young enough to have graduated from the academy only a few years earlier. Their faces no longer reflected suspicion. They reflected humility. She walked toward the wall where her retired identification card still hung beneath the soft morning light. Gently lifting the wooden frame from its hook, she carried it to the dining table and placed it where everyone could see it clearly. "This card opened many doors during my career," she said quietly. "But after retirement, I learned something important. Most people stopped seeing the woman who earned it. They only saw a black woman living alone in a small apartment." Her words settled heavily over the officers. No accusation filled her voice. There was only quiet honesty. "Do you know what surprised me most?" she continued. "Not that mistakes happen. They always will. What surprised me was how often people decide who you are before asking your name." Daniel lowered his eyes. Those words struck deeper than any criticism could have. He remembered walking through the doorway, already believing he understood the person behind it. He had trusted reports, addresses, and assumptions more than simple human conversation. One of the younger officers stepped forward hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said, "I have only been wearing this badge for 11 months. I joined because I wanted to help people. I never wanted someone to feel afraid when they saw us." Angela smiled warmly. "Then do not let today make you defensive. Let it make you better." The young officer nodded, visibly moved. Carter looked around the apartment one final time. The books, the photographs, the volunteer awards, the carefully folded American flag, and the retired identification card all told the same story. None of those things had changed since before dawn. The only thing that had changed was the way everyone in the room now saw them. Carter took one careful step closer to Angela. "If you are willing," he said, "I would like every officer standing here to hear your story someday. Not because of what happened this morning, but because people entering this profession need to understand what service truly looks like." Angela looked out the window where golden sunlight now covered the courtyard. After a thoughtful pause, she answered with the same quiet grace that had carried her through the entire morning. "I will tell my story," she said softly. "If it helps even one person remember that respect should never depend on discovering someone's credentials after they have already been judged." The officers slowly began leaving the apartment, but none of them rushed toward the hallway. Each person paused for a brief moment, offering Angela a respectful nod before stepping outside. The atmosphere that had entered with urgency now departed with quiet reflection. Daniel Carter remained behind until the last uniform disappeared from the doorway. He looked once more at the small apartment that had taught his entire team a lesson no training manual could fully explain. "There is one more thing I need to do," he said softly. Angela tilted her head, waiting. Carter reached into his pocket and removed a small leather notebook he had carried for years. Inside were handwritten reminders collected throughout his career, quotes from mentors, lessons learned after difficult cases, and promises he had made to himself as a young officer. Turning to a blank page, he carefully wrote a single sentence before tearing it free. He placed the paper on the dining table beside the retired identification card. Angela glanced down and read the words in silence. They simply said, "Never let certainty replace humanity." Carter looked at her. "This will be the first sentence every new officer in my department reads on the first day of training." Angela folded the note carefully and smiled with quiet appreciation. "Then perhaps this morning will help someone I will never meet." Carter nodded. "I believe it already has." Just then another officer appeared cautiously in the doorway. It was the young patrolman who had spoken earlier. In his hands, he carried a small toolbox borrowed from the maintenance office downstairs. "Chief," he said, "I noticed the front door frame was damaged during our entry. The apartment manager said we have permission to repair it immediately." Carter looked at Angela before answering. "Only if Ms. Brooks is comfortable with that." Angela looked toward the doorway, then back at the young officer whose face carried genuine concern rather than obligation. "I would appreciate that very much," she replied. Within minutes, several officers quietly began measuring the frame, tightening loose hinges, replacing damaged trim, and cleaning scattered wood dust from the hallway floor. No one complained. No one checked the time. They worked together with the same discipline they had shown earlier, but now every movement carried a different purpose. Angela watched from her kitchen as fresh coffee filled several mugs. One by one, the officers accepted her invitation this time. They stood together in the living room, sharing warm coffee while morning sunlight poured through the windows. Conversation slowly replaced silence. They spoke about military families, neighborhood programs, children growing up too quickly, and the importance of earning trust one conversation at a time. For nearly an hour, there were no ranks, no assumptions, and no barriers. There were simply people listening to one another. As the repairs were completed, the young officer gently tested the front door. It opened and closed smoothly without the slightest resistance. He stepped back with a quiet smile. "It is better than it was before," he said. Angela looked at the repaired doorway, then at the officers standing together beneath the soft golden light filling her home. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the strongest repairs are not the ones made with wood or nails. They are the ones people choose to make inside themselves." No one answered immediately because everyone in the room knew she was right. By the time the last police vehicle disappeared from the apartment complex, the morning had fully awakened. Children waited for school buses at the corner. Neighbors carried newspapers back inside, and the ordinary rhythm of the city quietly returned as though nothing unusual had happened. Inside apartment 214, Angela Brooks stood beside the front window holding a warm mug of coffee while sunlight stretched across the polished hardwood floor. The repaired front door closed gently behind her with a smooth, quiet click. She rested one hand against the new frame for a brief moment before turning back toward the hallway. The retired identification card still sat on the dining table where she had placed it earlier. Slowly, she lifted it with both hands and walked toward the empty hook on the wall. She adjusted the frame carefully until it hung perfectly straight, then stepped back just enough to see it resting beside the photographs of family, neighbors, veterans, and children whose lives had crossed her own through years of quiet service. The identification card was no longer the most important object on that wall. It had become only one chapter in a much larger story. Several weeks passed. At police department headquarters, Chief Daniel Carter stood before a room filled with newly sworn officers beginning their careers. The atmosphere was hopeful, filled with ambition and determination. Instead of opening the orientation with department policies or legal procedures, he walked to a large projection screen displaying a single handwritten sentence. "Never let certainty replace humanity." The room grew silent as he explained where those words had come from. He never mentioned addresses or operational details. He never tried to defend the mistake that had been made. Instead, he described the importance of seeing people before seeing assumptions, of asking questions before reaching conclusions, and of remembering that every front door represented someone's life, memories, and dignity. Among the audience sat the young patrol officer from that morning. He smiled quietly, recognizing every lesson hidden between the chief's carefully chosen words. Across town, Angela continued living exactly as she always had. She volunteered at the community center 3 afternoons each week, helped veterans complete benefit applications, and tutored local children after school. Nothing about her daily routine changed because she had never measured success by recognition. One Saturday afternoon, a familiar patrol car stopped beside the community garden where she was helping children plant young oak trees. The young officer stepped out carrying a small maple sapling wrapped in burlap. "Ms. Brooks," he said with an easy smile, "the department wanted to thank you, but I thought this might mean more." Angela accepted the young tree with gentle hands. "Why a maple?" she asked. He smiled. "Because someone told me the strongest trees spend years growing roots nobody ever sees." Angela laughed softly. Together, they planted the sapling near the edge of the garden while children gathered around with watering cans and bright smiles. As fresh soil covered the roots, sunlight filtered through the leaves overhead, creating shifting patterns of gold across the ground. The breeze carried the quiet sounds of laughter, birdsong, and rustling branches. Angela stepped back beside the young officer, both of them looking at the newly planted tree, standing small but steady beneath the open sky. Neither spoke another word. They did not need to. Sometimes the truest form of justice is not found in punishment or recognition. Sometimes it lives in the quiet moment when people choose to become better than they were yesterday, leaving behind a future rooted not in fear, but in respect.